So thank you very much for participating in this interview. It's really wonderful to be able to launch this series by speaking to you about your experience here at Cambridge, and also going back a bit to your experience as Britain's first out MP and Britain's first out gay minister. You went into politics in 1983 to become the MP for Islington South and Finsbury, and then next year was when you came out publicly in a rally, I think it was, in Rugby in Warwickshire. Could you just tell us a little bit about going back to that moment? How did you decide that moment to come out as a gay politician?
Yes, indeed. And I'd actually been a local councillor in the borough of Islington for 5 years leading up to the 1983 election. But 1983 was when I was elected first as an MP for Islington South and Finsbury. And I'd never made any particular secret of the fact that I was gay in the period leading up to that, but I'd never made a big public statement about it. And I sort of decided pretty early on as an MP that at some point I wanted to say something publicly about who I was and what I was. Because I saw parliamentary colleagues who were trying to hide their sexuality, and they were being chased by the press, and they were having a really rotten time. And I just decided that the only way of avoiding having that rotten time was to remove the story by being open and forthright about who you are. And so I sort of in my mind, I'd made that decision. But the question was when and how to do it. About a year after I had been elected, the city of Rugby in the Midlands had made a decision. They'd just changed council control. And the new council had made a decision to remove sexual orientation from the list of things they would not discriminate against in their employment policy. So effectively they were saying, we do not want LGBTQ people coming to work for Rugby Council. And naturally a lot of people were very upset about this. There was a big march through the middle of Rugby on a Saturday lunchtime, followed by a huge meeting in a big community hall. And they'd invited me to go up and speak because I'd said supportive things, of course, about then lesbian and gay rights over the previous year. And so I agreed, and I remember I was sitting on the train going up to Rugby writing this very boring speech, and I arrived in the hall. The meeting had already started, absolutely packed out. And I was walking up through the audience to take my seat on the platform. And I just decided, this is the moment to do it. Because this rally is all about the ability of someone, no matter what their sexual orientation, to do every bit as good a job working for Rugby Council as anyone else. And exactly the same applies to MPs. And so I went up onto the platform, took my seat. It was about 10 minutes before I was due to speak. I'd have to say 10 of the scariest minutes in my life, because I was about to do something no one else had ever done. And when it was my turn to speak, I stood up and I began by saying, my name is Chris Smith. I'm the Labour MP for Islington South and Finsbury, and I'm gay. And at that point, the entire audience got to their feet and gave me a standing ovation. It's the only time I've ever had a standing ovation 1 minute into a speech. Since then, I have to say, I have never regretted that moment at all, ever.
An amazing moment that must have been. But also at a time politically when, lesbian and gay issues were increasingly controversial and there was really something of a backlash occurring. And when you were feeling concerned about what you were going to say, were you thinking this could cost me my job, or this could, really lead to quite severe consequences?
I wasn't thinking this is going to cost me my job. Well, at least not immediately. I did have only a majority of 363 votes. So, this was potentially risky stuff. What I did find, though, was that I had hundreds of letters came in. This was way before the days of social media and email and so on. So people wrote letters. And I had letters from people all over the country, many of them saying, well done, good on you. But the ones which really meant the most to me were the letters that said, thank you, it's made it easier for me. And that sort of made it all worthwhile. And it was a very hostile time. It was the time of the pretty police entrapping people in Earl's Court. Customs and Excise raided Gay's the Word bookshop. The offices of Capital Gay newspaper in London were firebombed. The tabloids were full of things about loony councils giving grants for lesbian gym mats and things. This was quite a severely homophobic time. So it wasn't ideal circumstances to put my head above the parapet and say this, but I just felt it had to be done. And I feel very strongly that the reason we have made so much progress since then on all of the LGBTQ equality issues since then is because people, not just me or other big public figures, but people everywhere in communities, in families, in workplaces, have put their heads above the parapet and have said, yes, I am. And that has done so much to change people's attitudes and people's minds.
Could you maybe say something about, was that the question of being a role model, which is a public figure you're likely to become, and you clearly did become, was that part of the calculation behind what you did as you were walking through the aisle and you made that statement, or that was something that simply occurred afterwards? But
it happened.
Yeah.
I wasn't thinking I am going to be a trailblazer here. I'm going to be a role model. None of that occurred to me. It was purely, am I going to be honest about myself? Yes, maybe it's going to be difficult. Maybe it's going to make it more difficult to get re-elected in 4 years' time. But I need to say this.
And the press response was?
The press response was immediately fairly muted. A handful of articles, but nothing really terrible. But then just occasionally from time to time something would crop up. I remember The Sun published a really horrible cartoon about 2 or 3 months later, ever at the forefront of the news. That was really hurtful. But after a while you sort of got used to that. I remember also the following Friday, the Islington Gazette came out. This was the newspaper that was read by the vast majority of my constituents. Came out once a week. And it came out the following Friday with a banner headline, "I'm gay, says MP," on the front page. Next to, I have to say, about the worst photograph they've ever published of me. And I thought when that came out that I was going to get a very hostile reaction from my constituents. And I remember that evening I was doing a constituency surgery, as I did every Friday evening, and I must have seen 25, 30 different people. Not a single one of them mentioned the front page of the Islington Gazette. And I think apart from one shouted comment across a street, I got no adverse comment from any of my constituents over the succeeding week or two.
I mean, in subsequent years, it didn't seem, however, that very many other politicians followed your lead, because it was, what, 13 years?
It was about 9 years before another MP came out. Now, of course, there are over 40, and we have the biggest openly LGBT, we don't have any T yet, but we have the biggest openly LGB contingent of any parliament anywhere in the world. But I think they were just, they were still nervous. It may well have been easier for me in a metropolitan seat in the middle of London than it might have been for someone in a more industrial seat or in a more rural seat. But actually, I don't think they needed to worry. And I remember when we got to the subsequent election in 1987. Remember, I'm defending a majority of 363 votes. In second place in the constituency were what were then the Social Democrats. So it wasn't a Labour-Tory fight. It was a Labour-Social Democrat fight. Now, the Conservatives during that election, even though they were running a very homophobic national campaign, locally, the Conservatives never, ever mentioned the issue at all. They were, they fought an entirely honourable campaign. The Social Democrats, however, did not. And they were talking on doorsteps, and they never published anything. But when they were canvassing, they were saying, "Oh, you don't want to vote for him; he's queer." And I remember we trained all of our canvassers. If this issue comes up, how are you going to deal with it? And we said, you've got 3 lines to use. Line number 1, isn't it good to have an MP who's honest for a change? Line number 2, but you know that Chris Smith works for everyone, no matter who or what they are. Line number 3, if neither of those 2 worked, you're not meaning to tell me you're prejudiced, are you? And interestingly, no one in the entire campaign had to get to line 3.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that it was a period, especially in the second half of the 1980s, when there was an increasingly homophobic climate in many ways, particularly around Clause 28. And it did sometimes seem as though the Tory party was quite keen to promote a homophobic agenda in perhaps a sort of populist way. How do you interpret that period, and what did it feel like to be, in some senses, on your own as a publicly gay figure?
I remember one of the debates we had in the House of Commons on Section 28. There was how can I put it, a Neanderthal Tory called Nicholas Winterton, who was making a speech. And I got up to intervene and make a point. And as I was sitting down, he said, the House has learned to listen to the Honourable gentleman, pointing at me, with respect when he talks about these matters. But, and then he went on to disagree with me. But the fact that he felt he had to say that actually revealed to me that simply by being there, we'd made a big leap forward, because this wasn't some Martian from outer space that he was talking about. He was talking about people, and there was one of them sitting there in front of him in the House of Commons, and he had to acknowledge that. And that, I think, really helped to make the debate a little bit more civilized than it might otherwise have been.
I wonder about alliances at that point. Even if you were the only one who was out amongst MPs, presumably there were people supporting you more or less informally and maybe across party lines, or?
There was a lot of support. I had nothing but support from my own party leadership. Neil Kinnock was the leader of the party at the time, very supportive. John Smith demanded that I should join his shadow treasury team a couple of years later. The chief whip made me the London whip towards the end of that parliament. It's within the Labour Party, wholesale support. And increasingly people across the other side of the chamber as well. My favourite moment was Edwina Currie. This was shortly after I'd done the rugby speech, and I was in what was known as the tea room of the House of Commons, queuing up to get a cup of tea. Lots of MPs sitting around, and Edwina comes marching up, and in a very loud voice, she says to me, "Chris, I hear you've come out. Well done." And she turned on her heel and marched off. And I thought, yeah, good on you.
Yeah, good on you, Edwina.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in addition to being, a pioneering politician in relation to coming out, you've also been a very influential campaigner around HIV, which was also a huge issue in the 1980s. And you were yourself diagnosed as HIV positive shortly afterwards in 1987. Was that something that influenced how you understood the very homophobic climate at the time?
A lot of the homophobia that was happening around then was linked to the emergence of HIV as a serious health challenge. And it was the time of the adverts with tombstones and icebergs and things. There was a lot of mythology around. For quite a few years, people regarded HIV as bringing a death sentence with it. And indeed, when I was first diagnosed with HIV, I had absolutely no idea how long I was going to live or how short a time I was going to have. Now, fortunately, we've advanced an awful lot in terms of medical responses since then. Still quite a lot of prejudice. The people with HIV face, in some ways, two diseases. The actual disease they have, but also the disease of prejudice. But we have moved on since then. But making sure that the we began to develop the right sort of medical and social support for people living with HIV was something that I did work very hard with colleagues on. I helped to set up the all-party parliamentary group on HIV. I organised meetings. I made sure that organisations like the Terence Higgins Trust and the National AIDS Trust were able to have access to government ministers. And I think Norman Fowler, who was the Secretary of State for Health at the time, deserves considerable credit for making sure that the response of the UK government and the NHS was measured and was responsible and was responsive to the needs of people with HIV.
Presumably it's were the two experiences similar to you, or was the one more difficult than the other? That is, coming out as gay at that rally and then coming out as HIV positive. Are they, in a sense, it is a kind of coming out, but I guess it has a different character.
It took me far longer to say anything publicly about my HIV status. I didn't do that until 2005. A long time after I'd first been diagnosed. And one of the reasons I did it was that Nelson Mandela had just given a very remarkable speech at or around the time of the funeral of his son, who had died of HIV. And he said, we must stop keeping quiet about this. We've got to talk about it. We've got to say it. We've got to tell the world about it. And I sort of thought, well, perhaps, yes, this is the time when I ought to say something about it. And I did it in cooperation with the Sunday Times. They sort of held the front page for me for it. I remember there was a lot of publicity over that Sunday, and I walked into my parliamentary office on the Monday morning, and there was a note on my desk saying, please ring Mr. Mandela, with a telephone number. And so I rang this telephone number, which was in South Africa, and there at the other end of the telephone was Nelson Mandela saying, I just wanted to say thank you and well done and good luck, and that
wonderful thing. And
that sort of made it worth it.
Absolutely. And on that occasion, I guess you were consciously being a role model as well. And talking about Mandela suggests that you had role models of your own, and I will wonder about that. I mean, in the ways that you've navigated these kinds of questions during your life, who are the people who might have inspired you, either within the LGBTQ movement as it developed over that time, or, I mean, people like Mandela who in a sense were allies of a certain kind. But
Mandela was certainly a role model, and interestingly, one of the things I was trying to do on that Sunday when I was giving all the interviews and so on was really to say two things. One was I said at the time, I've been living with HIV now for 18 years. I've been a cabinet minister. I've done a lot of different things in that time. And what I hope I've been able to demonstrate is that it is possible to live with HIV and make a huge contribution to society at the same time. And people who are out there who are living with HIV should feel that too. And the other thing I was saying is I've, in a perverse kind of way, been lucky. I've had this thing in a country where there is a National Health Service and there are medical answers and there is support available for people in this sort of position. There are many people around the world who don't have that sort of opportunity, and we need to think about them as well. The get back to your question about role models. One role model in particular, Edwin Cameron, Justice in the Supreme Court of South Africa, a great friend of Nelson Mandela. He not only came out very publicly, very early on, even in the time of before apartheid had fully ended, as being gay. He also came out as having HIV. And a remarkable man, still in the Supreme Constitutional Court of South Africa, and still very much a role model.
Interesting. Yeah. And then I suppose there were other politicians like Barney Frank in the United States who also were coming out a bit later than you, but
yes, I remember going across to the States quite shortly after I'd done my rugby speech, because I suddenly found myself in demand around the world to talk about this. And I went to the States to a gathering of openly gay elected and appointed officials. Now, these were mostly people who were state senators or mayors of Californian small towns, or council members in the city council in Boston, and that sort of level. Still no Congress, members of Congress or senators. But Barney Frank came out round about that time and became a great friend. And occasionally when he was over in London, we'd meet up, and if I was over in Washington, we'd meet up. He was, of course, had a wicked sense of humour, had a very rumbustious kind of political style. Now, sadly, retired from Congress, but and a great loss to Congress. But he became a great friend and the first openly gay member of Congress. There had been one, Gary Studds, who'd been outed a little bit before him, but Barney was the first person who voluntarily went public. But the person who was really on my conscience was Sven Robinson, who was a Canadian Member of Parliament, a New Democrat from Vancouver. And he'd come over to the UK after my rugby moment. He'd come over to come and see me for advice, because he was thinking of coming out in Canada. And I can remember sitting down with him and saying, "Oh, yeah, go ahead, do it. It's a breeze. You don't have anything to worry about at all." So he did. He went back to Canada. He didn't do it at a rally in a Midlands town. He did it on primetime Saturday evening television in Canada. It dominated the airwaves for days afterwards. It produced huge controversy. He had lighted rags thrown through the letterbox of his constituency office. He had sackfuls of hate mail. He also had sackfuls of support mail, but he became a huge figure in Canadian politics because of this statement he'd made. And I told him it was going to be easy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But he remains a good friend, and it ended up being absolutely the right thing for him to have done.
Yeah. Maybe we could move on a little to in your political career, to the ministerial career. And when you had the portfolio for arts and culture, then that leads me to raise questions about arts and culture as a way of helping to support or question or explore LGBTQ identities, and what your experience. I suppose a lot of people who don't live in metropolitan centres might read a book. It might be their first experience of having LGBTQ experience reflected back to them. So a question about arts and culture, really, and its importance in campaigning, really, for understanding LGBTQ issues.
As with all aspects of life, the way in which art and culture develop the portrayal of something can be hugely transformative in the way in which it manages to change perceptions and thinking. There was one wonderful moment I remember. I don't know if you ever saw the movie Prick Up Your Ears about Joe Orton. Yeah. Joe Orton, of course, and his lover Kenneth Halliwell. The two of them lived in Islington, and famously they defaced a number of Islington library books, drawing pictures in them and putting them back on the shelves, and they were subsequently discovered. They are now honoured treasures of Islington Council. But at the time, there was a big controversy, and in the movie, there are two elderly librarians walking out of the Central Library, and one of them says to the other, "I gather the two are homosexuals," and the other one says, "Homosexuals in Islington?" I saw this at the Screen on the Green in Islington, and the entire cinema roared with laughter at that point. But in those early days, in the 1980s, there were some brave bits of drama. There were things like Entertaining Mr. Sloane or My Night with Reg and so on. There were some brave bits of cinema, some of it around the AIDS theme rather than just around a gay theme. But gradually it became, these were sort of isolated moments of cultural expression in those early days. But within quite a short period of time, it became much more common. Some of it's still controversial. Some of the controversies over Robert Mapplethorpe's images and the holding of exhibitions of Mapplethorpe's work and so on. In the United States, some of it was banned. Here, fortunately, we take a rather more enlightened view. And culture has grown with the issue over the course of the last 20, 25 years, as society has grown with the issue over that period as well, I think.
I mean, you did your undergraduate degree here at Pembroke, and then you wrote your PhD about Wordsworth and Coleridge, and now you're back as Master of Pembroke. And how do you feel that your history and politics and your work in arts and culture for the government has influenced your return to higher education?
Well, there is, I have to say, a rather lovely circularity about life. Having started out as a student here a very long time ago, and now coming back as master. while I was here, I wasn't out. I was still really coming to terms with my sexuality. And in those days, it was very, very rare for anyone to be open as a student about being LGBTQ. Now, happily, it is something that many students, not all by any means, many students feel much more confident about expressing and being part of. And I think one of the things that I can offer, both by simply what I've done over the course of my career, but also the way in which I go about supporting and welcoming students. One of the things I can offer as the openly gay head of a college is to make people feel very comfortable, very welcomed, very confident about being who they are. And so every year I will give LGBTQ drinks for students here in Pembroke. Every year I will make sure that we fly the rainbow flag at the start of LGBTQ History Month. I will try and make sure that any student who has any sort of anxiety or whatever is properly supported and looked after. Creating the right sort of environment in which people do genuinely feel able to be themselves is a very important part of creating a university community.
Well, you've also been enormously supportive of the new LGBTQ plus program here at Cambridge, and we're very grateful for the support that you've given us. And I wonder, do you have any advice for us about where that program should go, or what that program can do to make Cambridge a stronger place for everyone?
I think there's a big role to play here in developing the academic excellence of research in thinking about the role and position of LGBTQ people within society, both here in the UK and around the world. And Cambridge, with its academic standing, its academic rigour, the way in which it can approach these issues in an intelligent, non-judgmental, non-partisan kind of way, I think has a big role to play in moving some of these thoughts further forward. The way in which the history of the history of sexual orientation, the literature of sexual orientation, the cultural standing of differences of sexual orientation, the social science of sexual orientation, the ways in which these can be looked at with academic rigour. That's something that I think Cambridge really does have a unique position to offer on.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much.
Yep.